Give her the ring, Elena. Now.
But it's mine.
He told her to take it off, right there in the hotel lobby in front of his mother. He pointed at his mistress and said, "Give her the ring. You never deserved it anyway." Elena slowly slipped the engagement ring from her finger and placed it in the mistress's hand. Everyone smiled, expecting tears. Elena didn't argue. She simply watched. Then the mistress turned the ring over, read the words engraved inside, and suddenly nobody was smiling anymore. Because those few words, cut into the gold 16 years before, did not say what an engagement ring is supposed to say. They were not a sentiment, they were an instruction, and they were about to strip everything from the man who had just so proudly given the ring away. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps this channel grow. Now, let's begin. It had begun 3 weeks before that afternoon in the lobby, and it had begun quietly, the way the worst things usually do. The bell above the door at Harwell and Vane on New Bond Street made the same soft, expensive sound it had made for 140 years, and Elena Ashcombe stepped inside on a gray Tuesday morning the way a woman steps into a room she has always been welcome in. She was not there as a customer. She had come to collect a Georgian mourning brooch on loan from the auction house where she catalogued estate jewelry, and the errand was so ordinary that she was already thinking about lunch. The young man behind the counter recognized her and slid the brooch across the velvet. Then, because he was new and eager and wanted to be helpful, he glanced at the emerald-cut diamond on her left hand and said the thing that would sit in her chest for the next 3 weeks. "Beautiful setting, Mrs. Ashcombe. We resized it for you back in March, didn't we?" Elena smiled and said, "Yes, of course, thank you." She had never had the ring resized in her life. She kept smiling as she signed for the brooch, because that is what composed women do while the floor tilts beneath them. The ledger was open on the counter, turned toward her for habit, and her eyes moved across it the way a trained eye moves across a page without deciding to. There, under the March entries, was the ring's private reference number. She knew it because she knew everything about that ring's paperwork, logged for a resize down half a size, collected in person, paid on a card that was not Adrian's and not hers. The name beside the transaction was one she did not recognize. She did not ask. She thanked the young man again and tucked the brooch into her bag and walked back out into the noise of Bond Street with her heart doing something slow and terrible behind her ribs. Half a size smaller, for a finger that was not hers. The Ashcombe name meant a great deal in London, and Adrian Ashcombe had spent his whole life polishing it. He was 41, tall in the way that photographs love, and he ran the private client arm of Ashcombe and Vane, the wealth firm his great-grandfather had built out of shipping money and better manners. He gave to the right hospitals. He sat on the right 2 boards. He had a way of laughing at his own expense at dinner parties that made powerful men trust him and their wives forgive him things they had not yet caught him doing. When Adrian entered a room, the room reorganized itself around him, and he had come to believe over the years that this was simply the natural weather of his life rather than something other people generously provided. From the outside, the marriage was flawless, and the outside was where the Ashcombes did most of their living. There were photographs of Adrian and Elena at the National Gallery summer benefit, his hand at the small of her back, her Vanderhoff gown the color of old champagne. There were the anniversary posts, the matching ski tans, the box at Glyndebourne. People who met them once came away certain they had witnessed something rare, a wealthy man who still looked at his wife as though she was interesting. Adrian was good at the looking. He had learned the appearance of devotion cost far less than the thing itself and purchased almost the same amount of goodwill. He was not, in his own private accounting, a bad man. He was simply a man who had discovered early that charm could be spent like currency and who had never once been handed the bill. What most of those admirers did not know was that Elena Ashcombe was not decoration. She was, at 38, the senior specialist in historic jewelry at one of the two great auction houses in London, the person other experts telephoned when a stone had a story that needed proving or disproving. She could read a hallmark the way other people read a headline. She could date a cut to a decade by the light it threw. She had come from nothing anyone in the Ashcombe orbit considered relevant. A Marchetti, her father a watch repairer in Clerkenwell, who had taught her to love the insides of precious things, the tiny worlds of gears and settings and secret inscriptions that owners never bothered to look at. Elena had married Adrian for love and had kept her own name at work and her own accounts at the bank. And this last habit, small and unglamorous, would matter more than anyone in the family had ever imagined. She had never needed the Ashcombe money and had been quietly careful over 16 years never to become dependent on it, a discipline the family read as coldness and Adrian read as pride. In truth, it was only the instinct of a watch repairer's daughter who had learned young that the people who own beautiful things are not always the people who understand them. It was about to become the most important thing about her. The family, in practice, meant Margaret Ashcombe, Adrian's mother, 73 and undethroned. Margaret lived at the top of the family, in the great house on Ellsworth Row in Belgravia, at the head of every table, in the final word of every decision that touched the Ashcombe name. She had never been cruel to Elena exactly. Cruelty was too naked for Margaret, who preferred the cooler instruments of a raised eyebrow and a compliment with a hook inside it. For 16 years, she had made Elena feel with exquisite consistency like a guest who had stayed slightly too long. And yet there had been one afternoon, long ago, when Margaret had been almost tender, the week of the engagement, when she had taken the family ring to be inscribed and had pressed it into Elena's hand herself, her eyes wet, saying something Elena had been too overwhelmed to properly hear. Elena had worn the ring for 16 years and in all that time had never once looked at what was written inside the band. The house on Ellsworth Row was the kind of luxury that whispered rather than shouted. Nash stucco, a black lacquered door, a hall that smelled of beeswax and cut lilies, and old money that stopped needing to prove itself. It was here, at a Sunday lunch, 3 days after the jeweler's remark, that Elena felt the second crack open. Adrian's phone lay face down beside his plate, a small change of habit she noticed the way she noticed a stone reset by a clumsier hand than the original. He excused himself twice to take calls in the garden. He had begun wearing a cologne she had not bought him, something with cedar in it, and he had grown attentive in the particular overcorrected way of a man managing a guilty conscience. A hand on her shoulder held a beat too long, a compliment aimed slightly wide of her actual face. Elena said nothing. She passed the potatoes, she watched Margaret watch her son, and saw, for just a moment, something like satisfaction move across the old woman's face. There was a name, too. It surfaced the following week, on a Thursday, in the most banal way, a courier's receipt left in the pocket of Adrian's coat when Elena reached in for the car keys. A delivery to a flat in Chelsea, an address she did not know, signed for by S. Roche. Elena stood in the hall with the slip of paper in her fingers and made herself breathe. She could have gone upstairs and confronted him then, could have thrown the receipt on the bed and demanded a name and a reason. That was what a different woman would have done, and it was what Adrian on some level was braced for and even hoping for. The scene, the tears, the mess that would let him cast her as the hysteric and himself as the weary victim. Elena did not give it to him. She put the receipt back exactly where she had found it, at exactly the angle it had been. Something was wrong. She was going to find out precisely how wrong before she said a single word. Elena did not investigate the way a heartbroken wife investigates. She investigated the way she authenticated a disputed necklace, on paper, in a straight line from fact to fact, refusing to let feeling touch the evidence. Over the following fortnight, she did not follow Adrian, did not read his messages, did not confide in a single friend who, from love or boredom, might let it slip. She built a file instead. She began with the ring because the ring was where the wrongness had first shown itself, and because the ring was the one thing in this marriage she understood better than her husband ever would. She returned to Harwell in vain on a pretext, a question about a client's setting, and let the conversation drift until the manager, an older man who had known her for years and trusted her utterly, pulled the March record for her without a second thought. The resize had been arranged not by Adrian at all, but by Margaret. Margaret had brought the ring in herself, had it taken down half a size, and had it collected by a young woman she described to the staff as my son's fiancée. The word sat in the file like a splinter. Fiancé. Adrian was already married, which meant that somewhere in the private architecture of this family a future had been drawn up in which Elena did not appear, and the plans were far enough along that the ring, her ring, had already been altered to fit another woman's hand. She thanked the manager. She walked to a bench in the churchyard behind the shop and sat very still for a long time. The other woman had a name now, and soon she had a face. Elena did not go looking for it. The city, as cities do, simply handed it over. She saw them together entirely by accident, through the window of a restaurant off Sloane Square where she had stopped only because it had begun to rain. Sabine Roach was perhaps 30, striking in the deliberate, well-maintained way of a woman who has decided her looks are a career, and she was wearing entitlement more visibly than any jewelry. She laughed with her whole throat. She touched Adrian's wrist as though she owned it, and on her right hand, not her left, she wore a ring Elena recognized at 40 feet, because it was not yet on the correct finger, because Sabine was practicing, the way one practices a signature before it becomes legally binding. Elena stood in the rain and watched her own life being tried on by a stranger, and she did not make a sound. Piece by piece, the double life resolved into focus, and the more concrete it became, the less it hurt, and the more clearly she could think. A flat in Chelsea, leased in Adrian's name, £8,200 a month, taken the previous autumn. Dinners on a card she had never seen, a standing Friday reservation at a members' club in Mayfair, the same club where Sabine Roach had once worked front of house, which told Elena most of what she needed to know about how the two of them had met. Laid out on the dining table one afternoon, the receipts had the tidy, damning shape of a paper trail rather than a passion. Sabine wanted security, the roof and the ring and the name that would place her beyond the precariousness she had climbed out of. Adrian wanted to feel again like the most interesting man in the room. Between them there was almost enough truth to make a tragedy. Not quite. To be fair to Adrian, and history would not be, the affair had not begun as calculation, it had begun as a kind of drowning. Somewhere in his late 30s, the world had started handing its attention to younger men, and Elena, whom he had once been so proud to have won, had become in his mind a standing measure of his own shrinking. She was better at her work than he was at his. He needed nothing from him, not his money, not his name, not his rescue, and a certain kind of man cannot forgive a woman for requiring nothing of him, because it leaves him nothing to be. Sabine required a great deal. Sabine looked at him the way Rooms had looked at him at 30, and in the warmth of that looking he had mistaken his own relief for love. He told himself he was unhappy. He told himself Elena was cold. He was not lying exactly. He had simply never learned the difference between being adored and being known, and he had chosen, as such men do, the one that asked less of him. Then, on a quiet Tuesday night with Adrian away on a conference that Elena now understood was not a conference, she did the thing she had been avoiding. She sat at her father's old jeweler's bench in the spare room, switched on the Luke lamp, slid the emerald-cut ring from her finger and turned it over to look inside the band for the first time in 16 years. She had expected initials, perhaps a date, the small sentimental scratchings that couples leave for no one but themselves. What she found instead made her sit back in the chair. The interior of the band was engraved in a fine, old-fashioned hand, and it did not say what an engagement ring says. It carried the Ashcombe family motto, Quod teneo, teneo, what I hold, and beneath it 3 initials that were not hers and not Adrian's, and a single line of smaller text that she read once, and then again, and then a third time while the room went very quiet around her. There was a line inside that band she had never read. Now she could not stop reading it. Because Elena's whole profession was provenance, she knew that an inscription is never only sentiment, it is a claim, and claims can be traced. She spent the next 3 days doing what she did for a living, only this time the object was her own marriage. Her role at the auction house had, over the years, given her professional cause to catalog the Ashcombe collection for insurance, which meant she had legitimate access to the old family papers lodged with the estate's solicitors, the deeds, the schedules, the trust instruments that Adrian had never in his life bothered to read, because he had always assumed they would simply keep being true on his behalf. And there, in a document drafted the year Adrian's father died, Elena found the thing the engraving had been quietly pointing at all along. The bulk of the Ashcombe fortune, the shares in the firm, the house on Ellsworth Row, the whole gleaming edifice did not belong to Adrian at all. It sat inside the Ashcombe family settlement, an old and eccentric trust, and the settlement named its beneficiary not by law of inheritance, but by a token, the bearer of the family ring, being she whose name is joined to the house motto within the band. She read the clause a dozen times to be sure she was not seeing what she wished to see. She was not. The language was archaic and a little mad, the way old family instruments often are, drafted by a solicitor long dead and never once revisited, but its meaning was not in doubt. Decades earlier, Margaret, determined that the estate would pass through the woman she deemed worthy rather than be gambled or divorced away by a careless heir, had tied the entire settlement to the ring and to the name inscribed inside it. She had trusted metal over men. She had believed, with the certainty of a woman who had watched her own husband make and lose fortunes, that gold would be more loyal than blood, and she had built the whole future of the family on a sentence cut into the inside of a band. The instrument had gone on quietly working for decades, precisely because no one ever touched it. The firm paid the settlement's income out as dividends, the household ran on those distributions, and Adrian, who had never in his life read a document that arrived already obeying him, assumed the money was his simply because it had always simply arrived. On the week of the engagement, in her one moment of genuine warmth, Margaret had taken the ring to be inscribed with Elena's initials beneath the motto and pressed it into her hands with wet eyes. Now it is yours, and everything it holds. She had meant it as love, and she had never once, in the 16 years since, imagined it as a danger, because Margaret had never believed Elena would leave. Cool toward her as she had grown, the old woman was certain of one thing above all, that the ring could be quietly recovered and reinscribed whenever the moment came. It had never occurred to her that the band might be handed away with Elena's name still inside it, in public, before any of the paperwork was done, or that the law would care far more about the engraving than about anyone's intentions. Elena sat with the deed on her lap and understood at last the full and terrible size of what she was holding. She telephoned no one that night. There was one person she trusted with the confirmation, and she went to see him in daylight, Mr. Felden, the estate solicitor for 30 years, a discreet and precise old man who had never much liked Adrian and had always, in his dry way, respected Elena. She laid the ring and the deed on his desk and asked him one question, and watched him take out his own loop and read the band, and then set it down and look at her over his glasses for a long moment. "The instrument is unusual," he said carefully, "but it is valid, and it has never been amended. As matters stand, Mrs. Ashcombe, you are the settlement." He paused. "Does your husband know?" Elena thought about the flat in Chelsea and the ring resized for another woman's hand and the word fiancé written in a ledger while she was still, in the eyes of the law and the church, his wife. "No," she said, "and I would be very grateful, Mr. Felden, if it stayed that way a little longer." She now knew everything. What she did not yet know was when. That night, alone, she let herself feel it, once, fully, and then never again where anyone could see. She sat on the edge of the bath, in the dark, with the ring in her closed fist, and against her will she remembered the beginning. A rooftop in Lisbon, 16 years earlier, the river going gold beneath them. Adrian had been so nervous he had dropped the little box, and they had both gone down onto the warm tiles to find it, laughing, and when he finally slid the ring onto her finger, his hands had been shaking, and he had said, "I'll spend the whole of my life proving I was worth this." He had believed it then. She was almost certain he had believed it. That was the part that undid her. Not the mistress, not the fortune, but the memory of a younger man who had meant every word. She grieved for him, and for the 16 years, and for the mother-in-law whose one true kindness had curdled into contempt. She cried the way strong people cry, briefly, with her hand pressed hard against her mouth. Then she washed her face and put the grief away in the drawer where she kept everything she could not afford to show. When she came out, her hands were steady. They would stay steady for a long time. She did not have to engineer a confrontation, as it turned out, because the family engineered one for her, which was, in the end, its own kind of poetry. Margaret, believing the ground fully prepared, decided the transition should be handled the way the Ashcones handled everything, publicly, elegantly, and in a setting expensive enough to make it feel inevitable rather than cruel. There was to be a small family gathering at the Corley, the family's habitual hotel on a discreet Mayfair square, ostensibly a birthday luncheon for Margaret. Adrian let it be known to Elena, with the coward's tenderness of a man reading from a script his mother had written, that some difficult conversations would need to happen soon, that he had been unhappy for a long time, that he hoped she would be dignified about it. Elena said she understood. She said she would be there. She meant both. She prepared the way she prepared for the sale of a great collection, by controlling everything that could be controlled and appearing to control nothing at all. She asks Mr. Felden to attend the luncheon, quietly, as an old family friend paying respects to Margaret on her birthday, with a sealed folder in his briefcase that he was to open only if she gave a particular word. She lodged a certified copy of the deed with a second solicitor so that no document could conveniently vanish. She chose her clothes with care, not armor, nothing that announced a fight, but a deep bottle green dress that Adrian had once said made her look like a woman who could not be argued with, worn now for reasons he would not enjoy. And she left the ring exactly where it belonged, on her own left hand, its secret pressed against her palm, waiting. The days before the luncheon were a study in dramatic irony, and Elena moved through them the way a chess player moves through the moments after she has seen the mate her opponent has not. Adrian was almost kind to her that week, buoyant with the relief of a man who believes the hard part is behind him. One evening he even sat beside her on the sofa and took her hand, the left one, the ring warm between his fingers, and told her that whatever happened, he wanted her to be looked after, that he would be more than fair. Elena let him hold the ring. She let him believe it was a symbol of the marriage he was ending. She did not tell him it was the deed to the house he was sitting in, the shares that paid for the sofa, the entire weight of the name he wore so lightly. "I know you'll be fair, Adrian," she said, and he squeezed her hand, mistaking the calm in her voice for surrender. Across the city, in the flat in Chelsea, Sabine Roche was choosing what to wear to a luncheon where she had been promised she would, at last, be made real. Sabine had been told a version of events in which Adrian was the heroine. In her version, Adrian was a good man, trapped in a cold marriage to an ambitious, remote woman who cared more for her career and her old jewelry than him. In her version, the luncheon was the day the trap opened. She did not know that Elena was one of the most respected experts in the country. She did not know what the ring was, only that it was old and grand, and that it was going to be hers, resized already, waiting like a promise. She practiced in the mirror the gracious expression of a woman receiving something she has earned. She was not evil. She was hungry in the specific way of someone who has been poor and frightened and has decided that security is a thing you take with both hands when it is finally offered. She had simply been handed the wrong information, and she had built her whole hope on top of it. She would find out in a hotel lobby exactly how wrong. The night before, Elena permitted herself one more quiet human moment alone at her father's bench. She took out the loupe again and looked one last time at the words Margaret had cut into the gold in A Season of Love, quod teneo tionio, and beneath it E.M., her own initials, Elena Marchetti, the girl from Clerkenwell, and the small line that had told her everything. She thought about her father, who taught her that the truth of a precious thing is always on the inside, in the part no one bothers to look at. She was not triumphant. She was not even angry, not anymore. The anger had cooled into something clear and load-bearing. She polished the band gently with a cloth, the way he had taught her, and slid it back onto her finger. Then she went to bed and, to her own faint surprise, slept. And so the gray Tuesday at Harwell and Vane led 3 weeks later to that marble lobby, only now the moment wore its true weight. By 12:30, the Ashcombes had taken their marks, Margaret enthroned by the fireplace, receiving her birthday like tribute, Adrian bright with the certainty that today he became free, Sabine arriving last in her pale coat, her practiced expression already in place. What none of them knew, as Adrian crossed the marble and told his wife to take off the ring and give it to the woman beside him, was that Elena was already 10 moves ahead of them, and that the stage he had chosen for her humiliation was about to become hers. She looked at her husband's face, the 16 years in it, the cologne with cedar in it, the certainty that this was the moment he won, and she did exactly as he asked, drawing the ring from her finger and placing it in Sabine Roche's open, waiting hand. Everyone smiled, expecting tears. Elena did not argue. She simply watched, folded her hands, and waited, patient as a woman watching a child reach for something hot. She let Sabine savor the victory for 3 full seconds. Then she said it, quite pleasantly. "You should look inside it, Sabine. There's an inscription. It's really quite important." And because pride cannot resist admiring the thing it has just won, Sabine turned the ring over to read the words engraved inside the band. Sabine read it aloud, slowly, stumbling only a little on the Latin. Quod teneo teneo. A pause. E.M. Another pause, her brow creasing, and then the smaller line, the one Elena had read 100 times, in a voice that grew less certain with every syllable. The words themselves meant nothing to Sabine, a motto, some initials, a line of old text, and she looked up, half laughing, waiting for someone to explain the joke. But no one was laughing, because Margaret Ashcombe had gone the color of the marble behind her. The old woman was staring at the ring in Sabine's hand as though it had begun very quietly to burn, and her fingers had closed hard over the arms of the wingback chair, and every drop of satisfaction had drained out of her face. She knew that inscription. She had commissioned it. She had, 16 years ago, cut her own certainty into that gold with her own instructions, and she had spent every day since so sure the girl would never leave that she had let herself forget it was a loaded thing. And this morning you stood in the middle of a hotel and ordered me to hand the deed to your entire life to your girlfriend in front of witnesses.
"You're lying," Adrian said, but it came out with no weight behind it, and he already knew it. A man does not go that color over a lie he can disprove. He turned toward the window where an elderly man he had taken for another guest was folding a newspaper and getting to his feet. "I'm afraid she isn't." Mr. Felden crossed the marble unhurried, opened a folder, and laid a document on the low table, turned so the light caught the relevant clause. "The Ashcombe family settlement passes by the ring and by the name within it. That name has read E.M. since the year of the engagement, and it cannot be amended without the consent of the person it names. Consent Mrs. Ashcombe has never given. The resize in March altered the size of the band and nothing whatsoever of its legal effect." He looked mildly at Adrian. "You have never, at any point in your adult life, owned the things you have been spending. You have enjoyed them at Mrs. Ashcombe's pleasure, and that pleasure, I would say, concluded at about the moment you told her she never deserved them." The facade did not crack so much as collapse. Adrian reached for the deed and stopped, his hand hovering, because some animal part of him knew that touching it would only make it more real. His mouth opened and produced nothing. The weather he carried into every room simply switched off, and what was left on the marble was a middle-aged man in an expensive coat who had just learned, in public, that he was a guest in his own life. His hands had begun to shake. He turned to his mother and found her staring at the floor, and in that instant they both understood that she had done this, that the weapon in Sabine's hand had been forged by Margaret's own certainty 16 years before, and that there was no one to blame but the family itself. Sabine's denial lasted as long as it took her to read the room. She had come to be made real, and instead had been handed a piece of evidence, proof of a fortune that would never be hers, from a man who owned nothing to give. She turned on Adrian, and her practiced poise cracked all the way through. "You told me it was yours, the house, the firm, all of it. You told me I was leaving her from me, that I'd never have to be frightened about money again." Her voice climbed and broke. "Was any of it true? Even the leaving?" Adrian reached for one of his easy phrases. "Sabine, darling, let's not do this here." And the smallness of it seemed to be what finished her. She looked at him a long moment, as though seeing his actual size for the first time. "You're not even sorry. You're just caught." She set the ring down on the marble table with a small, precise click, straightened her coat, and walked out of the lobby of the Corley without looking back. She understood faster than he had that there was nothing behind her worth turning for. Elena picked up the ring from the table. She did not put it back on. She simply held it, warm again from Sabine's hand and the marble. And she looked at the small, shattered gathering, the grayed matriarch, the shaking son, the cousins edging toward the door, the concierge pretending very hard to look at his screen. Then she said the only thing she had come to say, in a voice so quiet the whole lobby leaned toward it. "You told me I never deserved it." She let the ring catch the light. Adrian, you were the one who never understood what it was." And she turned, unhurried, and walked out into the gray Mayfair afternoon, past the enormous white orchids, through the door the concierge scrambled to open, leaving the Ashcombes standing in the ruins of a scene they had written to destroy her. 3 months later, the shape of everyone's life had settled into its true form, the way a stone settles into a setting it was always cut for. The consequences, when they came, were not dramatic, they were merely accurate. Adrian Ashcombe had been, in the strictest legal sense, spending money that was not his for the better part of 2 decades, and once the settlement's terms became known within the firm, as such things always become known, the board of Ashcombe and Vane concluded with great regret and considerable relief that a managing partner who did not control the family's principal assets and publicly attempted to give away its central instrument was a man clients could be asked to trust. He was eased out with the particular gentleness reserved for people who can no longer be feared. The Members' Club, hearing the story second-hand and then third-hand, let his membership quietly lapse. The lease on the flat in Chelsea ran to its end and was not renewed because there was no longer an account to renew it from.
Margaret Ashcombe suffered the cruelest sentence of all, which was to keep living in the house she no longer owned, at the pleasure of the daughter-in-law she had spent 16 years diminishing. Elena did not evict her. That would have been a smaller act than the one she chose. She let Margaret remain on Ellsworth Row, in the great house with the black lacquered door, as a resident rather than a mistress of it. Every lily, every dinner, every polished floor, now a daily reminder that the empire she had ruled had passed by her own hand and her own certainty to the girl from Clerkenwell she had never thought good enough. Margaret grew quiet that autumn. She was sometimes seen in the garden, turning a trowel over her hands, saying little. Whatever she felt on the week of that long-ago engagement, when she wept and pressed the ring into Elena's hands and meant every word, she had it back now in the form of its exact and total consequence. Sabine Roche, to her credit, disappeared cleanly and did not sell her story, though 2 newspapers offered, and one of them offered well. She had wanted security and had been handed a lie dressed as one, and when the lie fell away, she did the sane and unglamorous thing. She left London, took a post managing a small hotel on the South Coast, and told the story to no one. She never contacted Adrian again. Elena, who might reasonably have hated her, found in the end that she could not. Sabine had been a weapon, not an author. The hand that aimed her had belonged to the Ashcombes. Elena Marchetti, she took her own name back entirely and wore it like a coat that had finally been tailored to fit, did not merely move on, she rose. She resigned her position at the auction house and opened her own consultancy in a set of rooms off St. James, advising museums and old families on the histories hidden inside their heirlooms, and within a year hers was the name that the 2 great houses telephoned when a stone had a story that needed proving. The Ashcombe family settlement she placed with Mr. Felden's help into a proper charitable structure that funded the training of young craftspeople, watchmakers, jewelers, restorers, the children of Clerkenwells everywhere, so that the fortune Margaret had guarded so jealously now went at last to hands that made things rather than hands that merely held them. As far as the ring, Elena never wore it again, and she never sold it. She had it placed in a small glass case on the mantel of her new consulting rooms, turned so that the band faced outward, and the inscription could be read by anyone who cared to look, Quod Tanio, Tanio, and beneath it the initials of a watch repairer's daughter, and the line that had undone an empire. Clients would sometimes bend to read it and ask what it meant, and Elena would tell them the truth, which was that it was the family motto, and that it meant, "What I hold, I hold." She never explained the rest. She did not need to. The words were doing exactly what her father had taught her the truth of a precious thing always does, sitting quietly on the inside in the part no one bothers to look at, waiting for the one person patient enough to turn it over. On a bright morning that first spring, Elena stood alone at the tall window of her rooms off St. James with a cup of coffee going cool in her hands, watching the light move across the rooftops of a city that once belonged, on paper, to a man who never read the papers. She was not thinking about Adrian or Margaret or the marble lobby or any of it. She was thinking that the light was good and that she had a Cartier tiara arriving at 11 with a provenance somebody wanted disproven, and that she was very much looking forward to being right about it. She turned the ring's glass case a quarter inch so the sun caught the gold. Then she finished her coffee and rolled up her sleeves and got to work, a woman who had held, all along, everything that mattered and had simply been waiting for the rest of them to find out. If you enjoyed this story, don't just watch and leave. Like this video, share it with friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel for more powerful and interesting stories. Bye! See you in the next one.